Solid Tales, History Uncovered. On Christmas Eve 1950, American soldiers were supposed to be home with their families. Instead, they were running for their lives through a frozen hell in North Korea. Welcome back to Solid Tales. History Uncovered. General Douglas MacArthur had promised a victory parade by Christmas. What he delivered was one of the most catastrophic military collapses in American history. Today, we dissect how a five-star American Caesar marched his invincible army into a frozen slaughterhouse. By October 1950, the Korean War seemed all but won. The Cold War had gone hot in June, and after the miraculous amphibious landing at Inchon, Douglas MacArthur believed in his own godlike invincibility. At the Wake Island Conference, he looked President Harry Truman in the eye and guaranteed that Chinese intervention was impossible. To MacArthur, conquering North Korea was nothing more than a mopping-up operation. He was blinded by Western arrogance and a belief in absolute technological supremacy. He simply could not fathom that a newly founded, war-torn agrarian nation would dare fight the world's greatest superpower. On November 24th, MacArthur flew to the front lines to launch his final masterstroke, the Home by Christmas offensive. This wasn't a military plan, it was a PR stunt. He tied the entire war to a public countdown, forcing his generals to push forward at any cost. Can you imagine being so arrogant that you ignore every single warning sign? MacArthur split his army in two. The 8th Army in the west and the X-Corps in the east were completely separated by the Nangnim Mountains. They could not support each other. General Edward Ullman's X-Corps stretched into isolated columns along narrow mountain roads. They sacrificed all their mobility just to satisfy MacArthur's obsession with speed. Pilots reported massive troop movements near the Yalu River. Captured Chinese soldiers told their interrogators that hundreds of thousands of men were waiting in the mountains. But MacArthur's headquarters dismissed all of it. They called them token volunteers and symbolic forces. When 1st Marine Division Commander General Oliver Smith warned that they were walking into a trap, he was called a coward. The American army advanced in marching formation, not battle formation. They were parading straight into an ambush. Just 24 hours after MacArthur's grand announcement, the trap snapped shut. At dusk on November 25th, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army unleashed hell along the Inchon River. The 38th, 39th, 40th, and 42nd Corps materialized out of the darkness. They bypassed American tanks and artillery and instantly surrounded the forward units of the 8th Army. 2 days later, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir began. 150,000 men of the Chinese 9th Army Group had secretly crossed the border. Under the most brutal camouflage discipline in modern military history, they had completely evaded American air power. They marched only at night. They slept during the day. They lit no fires. They wrapped themselves in white cloth to blend into the snow. It was a miracle of stealth, and the Americans had no idea they were there. When they struck at Sinhungni, Udamni, and Hagaruri, they brought a terror the Americans had never known. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. In this frozen wasteland, America's greatest strength became its greatest weakness. Truck batteries died, engine oil turned to sludge. The cold was so intense, it snapped the firing pins right out of American rifles. Like Napoleon and Hitler before him, MacArthur had declared war on winter, and winter was winning. On November 28th, a terrified MacArthur sent a desperate telegram to Washington. "We face an entirely new war," he wrote. The offensive was over, the retreat had begun. What happened next on the Western Front is still studied in military academies around the world. To cut off the fleeing 8th Army, the 113th Division of the 38th Army did the impossible. On foot, through jagged, frozen mountains, they marched 72.5 kilometers in just 14 hours. They seized the critical road junctions of Samsuri and Ryongwon-ni, beating the motorized American columns by exactly 5 minutes. The door slammed shut, the Western Front completely collapsed. The Americans realized they were fighting an army whose capacity for suffering defied all logic. The Chinese refused to fight set-piece battles. They used the night to infiltrate deep behind enemy lines. They attacked command posts, artillery batteries, and supply convoys. When an American unit realized its rear was cut off, panic spread like wildfire. Local retreats turned into a theater-wide rout. The Chinese had no heavy weapons, but they had something far more powerful: absolute willpower. Even when American artillery turned a ridge into moon dust, survivors would climb out of the craters and charge. The most haunting example is the frozen companies. Entire Chinese units froze to death in their foxholes, rifles still aimed at the enemy. They chose death over abandoning their posts. What would you have done in their place? Let me know in the comments. The Americans were forced to ask a terrible question: how much firepower does it take to stop an army that will not break? By November 30th, the trapped 1st Marine Division began its fighting retreat from the Chosin Reservoir to the port of Hungnam. Under constant air cover, they marched through 125 kilometers of frozen hell. Thousands died from cold, hunger, and enemy fire. It wasn't until December 24th, Christmas Eve, that the last American soldier was evacuated from Hungnam. MacArthur's home by Christmas promise had become a nightmare. The United Nations forces were driven completely out of North Korea, back below the 38th parallel. In this second phase offensive, the UN coalition suffered 36,000 casualties. Thousands were taken prisoner, mountains of tanks, artillery, and trucks were left burning in the snow. American morale was shattered. The overconfidence of November had turned into a deep, lasting fear of the Chinese infantrymen. The geopolitical shockwaves were enormous. On December 16th, Truman declared a national state of emergency and doubled the size of the US military. Desperate to avoid defeat, the American High Command seriously considered using nuclear weapons. They secretly shipped unassembled atomic bombs to the Pacific, sparking panic in Britain and France. As for Douglas MacArthur, his myth of invincibility was broken forever. His reputation in ruins and his insubordination growing, Truman fired him in April 1951. The MacArthur Christmas offensive remains one of the most important lessons in military history. The strongest armies do not fall because of the enemy's strength. They fall because of their own arrogance and blindness. If you found this story as haunting as I did, hit the like button and subscribe to SolidTales for more untold stories from history. Turn on the bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching. History Uncovered. Subscribe to SolidTales.